I would now like to introduce San Antonio Chamber of Commerce President and CEO, Richard Perez.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce 2020 Congressional Web Series. I added web, of course, because it was going to be a in-person web series, but of course, all the stuff that's going on with the coronavirus and sheltering in place, etc., we're doing it web, and we're very, very excited to bring this series to you. We're kicking it off with, of course, our good friend, Congressman Chip Roy. And so, Congressman, thank you for joining us. We're excited to hear from you in a few moments. Let me just get through a little bit of housekeeping. And I'd like to start by recognizing our sponsors. And we are so excited and thrilled that our businesses are still able to step up and help and provide resources to be able to sponsor this important series. And I'd like to recognize them now. So we have 4 Congressional Series sponsors, and those are Southwest Airlines, Walmart, Lockheed Martin, and Port San Antonio. Additionally, we have 2 event sponsors, and those event sponsors are Vulcan Materials Company and the San Antonio River Authority. And again, I'd like to just give them a shout out and thank them for their diligence, for their support, and for their sponsorship. It really allows us to keep furthering our work, and so we're very, very appreciative of that sponsorship. Additionally, I am thrilled to know that our chairman of the board and CEO of the Southwest Research Institute, Adam Hamilton, has joined us today. Mr. Chairman, thank you for joining us. We're thrilled that you're with us. All right, so these much anticipated events provide a great opportunity for our businesses and our leaders to hear directly from the members of the Bexar County delegation about the most pressing issues facing Congress and how they impact the San Antonio business climate. The insight and perspective they provide help the Chamber to identify the best strategies to effectively advocate for the needs and priorities of our business community. And there is no question that we have one of the most powerful, one of the most effective, and one of the most responsive congressional delegations in Washington, D.C. today. During today's event, Congressman Roy will share insight on federal resources available to mitigate and recover from COVID-19, talk about reopening the U.S. economy, and he's also providing time to answer your questions. So please use your chat function, as Stephanie was saying. Submit those questions, and we'll get them in the queue, and we'll ask them. All right. Let me introduce now our speaker. Congressman Roy is serving his first term in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing District 21. As you all know, District 21 stretches from South Austin through the Hill Country all the way down to downtown San Antonio. Congressman Roy is a dedicated conservative committed to restoring healthcare freedom, supporting the men and women of our military, reducing federal spending, and limiting government to promote freedom and opportunity for all Americans. Congressman Roy serves on the Budget, Oversight, and Veterans Affairs Committees and is the ranking member of the Oversight Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. A couple of fun facts about Congressman Roy are that his family moved to Hays County back in 1853. His grandpa was a Texas Ranger that served in Hays, Blanco, and Travis County. The congressman loves baseball, and he's quite a handyman, having rewired his whole house, built a tree house for his kids, built a barn, and also a big garden and greenhouse on his property. So we've got a handyman as well as an effective and helpful congressman. And so with that, Congressman, welcome. The floor is now yours.
Believe that we'll be able to engage in person soon. I'm going to speak for a few minutes, but I'm going to keep it pretty short because I really do want to get to questions and answers, and I hope that there will be a number of questions because I want to know what's on the hearts and minds of the people of San Antonio who are obviously so engaged in commerce and in driving our economy, and we know how hard the current situation is for all of us, and we're all trying to work together to get through it. But I would have loved to have talked about a broader array of issues, and if that's where y'all want to go, I'm happy to do it. But I'm going to focus a little bit here to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from and where I think things stand with respect to the virus and our current situation, and then we can go from there. Since the beginning of this, we've been working hard to try to make sure we're constantly in contact and in touch with the people that I represent in San Antonio in particular, throughout the Hill Country and into Austin. Early on, we were obviously dealing very directly with the effects of our great assets that we've got in San Antonio with respect to our bases and at Laughlin where we had a decent number of folks being brought there who were obviously exposed to the virus. And this was back in February in the early stages. We worked really hard together with the city administration and with the folks in San Antonio to make sure we were trying to represent the interests of the people while still doing what we do best in San Antonio, helping others and making sure we use those bases to help Americans who are in need. But we worked really hard to make sure people weren't going to be released and assumed to be able to go into the hospitals in San Antonio as they were being brought in, but rather we have an independent solution to make sure that people in San Antonio are protected. So I enjoyed working hard with my colleagues in the congressional delegation on both sides of the aisle and with the leadership in the city to try to make sure that we were doing that the right way and frankly push back a little bit on DOD and some of the assumptions being made about what might have to happen with San Antonio health facilities. We've been in constant contact with the hospitals and health facilities throughout the district, including obviously in San Antonio, getting feedback about where things stand on PPE and testing and the ability for us to be able to manage and deal with the current situation. I think we're in an increasingly good spot statewide, and that's true here in Central Texas in terms of our ability to handle any spikes, our bed capacity, working with the governor's office regularly to make sure that we know where we stand on that front. Meanwhile, obviously, Congress took action. Some of it good, some of it bad, and I'm happy to talk about both of those things. I think Congress is right to react and to take steps to try to deal with this situation. First, there was an $8.3 billion bill that I supported, which was ensuring that we have resources available to sort of deal with the initial phases of handling the coronavirus. I had a few concerns with that bill, but I think it was the right direction to take to try to make sure we had those resources. There was a second bill, I guess we'll call it phase 2, which was called the Family First, I think full acronym. But that bill, there were some good parts to it, and there were some, in my view, bad parts to it. Many of you will know I voted against that bill. There were about 45 of us in the House who did, and my primary concern there was that there was a mandate in place in that bill, well-intended to ensure those who are sick would be able to have sick leave that would be paid for. But here's the problem. You can't pay for sick leave if there's no job from which to take sick leave. And my concern was I was hearing with hundreds of businesses who believed that mandate would force them, and in fact it resulted in many initial layoffs, which we were desperately trying to avoid. Some people beat me up over that vote, but I stand by that vote as being, I think, the right thing for commerce activity and the people in the district that I represent. And then thirdly, we had the $2 trillion phase 3. I didn't get a chance to vote on that bill. That was a little bit of a controversy. We weren't in D.C. to have a roll call vote. And unfortunately, we had a voice vote on it. I think when you're spending $2 trillion, we should have had a roll call vote. And I wish would have done that. But I did publicly say I would have supported that bill and put that statement in the record saying I would have, because it was important for you to know where I came down on it. I had serious reservations about the bill, but there was $350 billion set aside for small business, as well as the additional $500 billion in flexibility for the Treasury Secretary and Fed to be able to use to help try to make sure that we have liquidity in the system. But the $350 billion was first and foremost on my mind. We had small businesses who were getting shut down by the power of government. And I felt it was important for us to have the dollars necessary to be able to deal with that. But there were serious problems in that bill. One was the unemployment insurance provision, which now pays people more not to work than to work. I found that to be a problem. And I've stated that problem at the time, worked with senators trying to block it. And unfortunately, and I'll put my partisan hat on for a minute, there was a party line vote where Democrats refused to work with us in the Senate to try to fix that provision. When it got to the House, we didn't have a chance to vote. So I had to sort of gun to my head, basically, and vote for the bill, despite knowing there were serious problems in the bill. My other reservations were in the PPP program. And I've written extensively about this. An op-ed appeared in the Wall Street Journal that I jointly wrote with Emily Knight with the Texas Restaurant Association. I've been in constant contact with restaurateurs in San Antonio and throughout the district who have serious problems and concerns about the PPP. Now, many of you have been able to get through and get a loan, but many of you have not. And that's a problem. And I think we need to fix the loan process part of the problem. But the bigger problem, or at least as big of a problem, is that we now have restaurants, hotels, other small businesses who are basically having to go out, borrow money thinking they might have to repay it in 6 months, hoping they'll get it forgiven by the government, with certain rules and requirements put in place on hiring people back, which is a goal we all share. But you can't hire people back because we have an unemployment insurance provision, which is paying people more not to work than to work, as I said before. That's a problem. So I've written about this extensively. I've been working with some of my Democratic colleagues and Republican colleagues to highlight this issue with leadership on both sides. Testified in a committee last week to these problems in the Small Business Committee, and we'll continue to try to elevate our concerns about that particular provision and sharing that up the chain and also with the White House. Finally, I did vote last week for the additional $300 billion. It had 460 in the end because it included hospital funding, to make sure that we could try to get the 700,000 businesses that were in the pipeline on the outside looking in, unable to get a loan. I wanted to make sure there were dollars there for that. Now, again, I would have preferred that we fix the PPP problems. I would have preferred that we not just throw money at it without taking those steps to fix it, but I had no amendment process. I had no ability to go in and fight for those specific changes. So we went and testified at the committee, and we're now sharing that direct communication with my colleagues, as well as getting the op-ed placed last Thursday in the Wall Street Journal, which I was happy to do. Finally, I'll just say this. My office is wide open trying to work for you all in whatever you need. If it's help getting through the PPP, if it's working to get loans, highlighting the problems like I just articulated, whether it was an issue like dealing with Lachlan, helping getting some of your loved ones home if they're stuck overseas, we're dealing with Peru, and then just generally trying to share your concerns about what's going on. I'll be happy to work with you all to do that. And the final point that I'll make is I have been an advocate for reopening. I do believe it is critically important for the well-being of all of you who risk capital, but also more importantly, employed people, and even more importantly than that, are engaged in our community and our society. We have to reopen our society. We need to be able to go and worship together, work together, interact together safely, do it the right way, but we've got to be able to strike that balance to do it. 30 million unemployed we're now up to in terms of those that have filed. And we know what we're facing with the first quarter results that we just saw and what's clearly coming out of the second quarter. I'm a firm believer that the fundamentals that were true 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, economically speaking, can return if we do our part to get in the right direction. But we got to move quickly. I applaud the governor for pushing us forward into a restart. I think we ought to be a little more aggressive with respect to restaurants who can't really truly open with 25% capacity, or barbershops who are on the outside looking in, unable to open. And there's been some restrictions on dentists and other things that I've got some concerns with. But I applaud the governor for leaning into trying to get us back to engagement. And again, it's our society, our communities, our lives that are all intertwined, that we need to be able to interact with each other, again, safely, and protect the most vulnerable. As we've seen from the data, it's people primarily 18 to 65 that are not being attacked by this virus that we can re-engage into our commercial activity and protect our seniors and our most vulnerable. I want to say one more, I've said this twice now, a final shout out here to the food bank in San Antonio, and for all of those who have been volunteering with them and all the hard work that they've engaged in. I've gone to, 4 or 5 of the food bank distribution centers, whether it's in San Antonio, down at the Alamo Dome. I think we've had 2,000 come through that day where we're putting food and distributing them into the vehicles, as well as some of the remote mobile locations. I've done Fredericksburg and did one down in Hayes County as well. So just want to give them a shout out and know that we're trying to work hard to keep the supply chain working and to make sure we've got the resources necessary. So we'll move on to questions. I'm sorry I went a little longer than I intended to, but I wanted to give that full cover, and happy to talk to anybody.
Well, Congressman Roy, thank you. Of course, as always, very clear, very direct. I did not realize that you had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, so we'll get that and we'll put it in on our site so that folks can be able to access that. So that would be very good.
We'll do that. We'll make sure you get it.
Excellent. So we do have a lot of questions coming in, so that's good. And remember, I want to remind everybody, please submit your questions via the chat function in this WebEx, and then I'll ask them. So question number 1, here we go. How will Congress balance the needs of Americans hit hard by COVID-19 and the deficit? How do we address the deficit long term?
That is a great question. It is a question I struggle with pretty constantly. I think I view, for what it's worth, this particular effort by Congress to react as different in an important way from some past bailout/stimulus efforts. I don't see this as much bailout and stimulus as much as I see it, flawed as it may be, and there are flaws. I see it as an important effort to try to help Americans, Texans in our case, we obviously care about our local Texans, but Americans get over the hump and get across the bridge because government is acting to prevent you from engaging in your livelihoods. Now, government may be appropriate in doing that, history will judge, in order to try to protect the public health. I happen to be one who believed that should have been a much shorter time to flatten the curve so you get your health facilities back, but then get back and engage in commerce safely and securely as best you can. And I think that's where we need to be, and I'm going to continue to push in that direction. But it was important for us to have some federal funding because businesses were being told you couldn't even do what you do to make a living. That is closer to eminent domain than it is fiscal stimulus, in my view. Now, that being said, I was on a call in my role in the Budget Committee that we're now facing a $3.7 trillion deficit for this year. That's an extraordinary number. It's something we haven't seen in the order of magnitude since World War II, really, in terms of the relative size of it. It was going to be about $1 trillion, which, by the way, is unconscionable. And you all know I was out advocating a long time ago for fiscal responsibility. So the balance is tough. Here's what I hope, and what a lot of us are talking about now. We need to now get busy really quickly. Stop looking to Washington to continue to throw money. We have now spent almost $3 trillion, 2.8 trillion or something of that order of magnitude. Some of it in loans, some of it we'll get back, but at least $1.7 trillion of it probably are just dollars out the door. It is what it is. We need to work hard to get through that, but we should not think that federal government should continue to just throw money at this. It's now the time for us to work together with the resources that we have deployed to get our engine of commerce fully back up operational. Obviously, we can adapt, do some things that are different. Wear masks when you need to on an airplane or in close quarters. But open up outdoor seating, in restaurants and get, our restaurants filled back up and do what we need to do to get commerce going. So I share that concern, and I'm going to be working really hard to try to balance it because we cannot spend our way through this.
Excellent. So another question along these same lines. So how do you balance what was already kind of in the hopper, if you will, for all the needs, MilCon, transportation, et cetera, with this big chunk of bucks that you just talked about a moment ago for COVID-19?
Well, I don't yet know from the House Democrat or Republican leadership what our current plan is now to deal with our normal funding operations, right? The original appropriations process has now been kind of thrown out the window in terms of timeline. And look, let's be honest. It's not like the appropriations process has been working like a finely tuned engine over the last, however many years. So we had a lot we needed to do to try to have that be a responsible and appropriate way to deal with the funding process. But right now, it sure seems like the odds are going to be high that we're going to be heading towards a CR type environment again come, September when we're hitting the end of our fiscal year. It's still only, May now, effectively tomorrow. So we still have a little bit of time to try to work through it. Maybe we'll work defense through it, and try to get a defense appropriations bill done and then figure out how we're going to move the levers with whatever we're spending now with respect to reaction to the virus. But a lot of that's going to depend a little bit on how fast we get going, right? Because we've got to get, the way I describe it and liken it to from, sort of a visual, the freight train of the American economy, the biggest economy in the history of mankind, is cruising along. And then we start pumping the brakes. And in many ways, rhetorically and then by order, by government actors, we've clamped down on it and slammed the brakes. That freight train is slowing down massively. It has not come to a halt. Big sectors of our economy are still going. Some businesses are making lots of money because it's a different environment, but many are getting crushed. So what we can't do is allow that freight train to come to a stop. We just can't do that. We need to be able to get that thing moving and momentum back in the positive direction. It won't be to full clip again for weeks, months, maybe a year, but we've got to be able to get that momentum heading back in the right direction. Otherwise, not only are we going to have economic difficulties, but the tax base, as you all know, gets absolutely demolished. Oil and gas, for example, that's getting crippled in Texas, the independents in particular, they fund a lot of our schools, hospitals, and a lot of our, tax base. So this is why I've been focused like a laser on what do we need to do, the steps we need to do to take to get, people's confidence back that they can re-engage in commerce, healthcare included.
Excellent. So here's an interesting one. Given what's been happening in Washington, do you see this as an opportunity to have a more collaborative Congress moving forward?
I sure hope so. And I say that as somebody who's an unapologetic conservative, as you all know. And I'll never really back away from my belief in what made Texas great and our belief in limited government, our belief that we don't want the federal government interfering. I mean, just today I saw a story that the Texas Tribune ran. I haven't run it to ground to see how true it is, but they ran a story about Texas A&M wanting to open up a lot of its labs to be able to deal with testing. And because they're certified for animal testing, even though they're high-quality labs, they can't use them for human testing. Well, that's insane in an environment like this where we're trying to ramp up testing. So red tape, getting the federal government's regulatory apparatus out of the way so we can ramp up testing and do what we do best in Texas. Let Texas be Texas, as I like to say. That's where we need to head and where we need to go. I am hopeful, although I've learned never to hold my breath in Washington for these kinds of things, that we will have a more collaborative approach. Just last Thursday, for example, when I was testifying in front of the Small Business Committee, I testified on behalf of small businesses in Texas that have been getting hammered, unable to use the PPP. Well, you know what? Adam Schiff was testifying along the same lines that the unemployment insurance provision, paying people, maybe 50% more to not work than to work, is a problem. And Dean Phillips, a colleague of mine from Minnesota, same thing. He's a younger member of the delegation, and we work together on different issues. He and I wrote a joint op-ed in January about our need to re-look at the long-term engagement in Iran and Iraq and how we do that. He and several Democrats. We had 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and an independent. And so I'm happy to work with colleagues across the aisle. I hope we will do that more. I think we can continue to do that. I'm trying to do that in oversight committees. We try to look at what the executive branch is doing. And we're going to have to do a lot of that right now to oversee, good grief, I mean, $2.5+ trillion of borrowing and taxpayer dollars that we got to oversee and make sure are being spent appropriately, which we have an obligation to do.
Excellent, excellent. Another question. So what are you hearing on the Hill regarding election security in November? Do you see voter registration and voting changing in response to the current pandemic?
I don't have a very good specific answer as to what specific action is currently being contemplated on the Hill because we've been so focused, or at least my office has been so focused on the small business issues, the PPP, making sure that we figure out how to get economic restart going, dealing with all of the, frankly, my office is getting inundated, and we're happy to answer those questions, but with all of y'all's questions. So I've only been focusing on a broader perspective on voting. My general view and belief is that we should be in a place in the fall for us to have a normal elections process, that we ought to go through it in the normal, thoughtful way. If we've got early voting in Texas where we can spread out voting over time and people can be spaced out depending on our current situation at that point in terms of managing the virus. Obviously, we want to avoid a spike in the fall. Some people have raised some concerns about a second wave. We want to try to beat it and beat it good and get ahead of it. So I'm a believer that we can maintain our existing elections, processes, frankly, in order to try to continue to maintain and improve election integrity and not open it up in a sort of, reactive environment where we change the way we do our elections in a way that might elevate and raise and frankly, raise the concerns, diminish our confidence in election security. We need to move in a more confidence-inspiring direction, not less. So that's what we're going to be working on.
Excellent. Thank you. Another question. Do you believe there might be a risk that we're seeing, particularly an infringement upon personal liberties as a result of what's going on with, kind of the closing of the society, having a shelter in place? How do you balance all that? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I really appreciate that question. I mean, look, obviously all of us want to work together, and we know there are times when you suspend our kind of normal order of life, right? I mean, we've made a lot of sacrifices in World War II in order to defeat two very horrible enemies. And we did it, I think, wisely and appropriately. Probably not without, if you go back in time and ask your grandparents or your parents or whoever it may be, not without some consternation, right, of giving up our ability to do normal activities. But for the most part, we try to balance that with maintaining civil liberties. And in this case right now, I've got some strong reservations about how far we've been going in a number of different fronts, right? And, it's not just the obvious things in terms of free speech and being able to go, raise your concerns and protest and engage in that kind of behavior, or shutting down, maybe, gun businesses that might infringe on Second Amendment liberties or other things. It's also just your general liberty that the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Jefferson penned with the pursuit of happiness, that is a fundamental part of who we are. So, is there an express right in the Constitution for you to be able to out and go sell widgets? No, there's not. But the concept of pursuit of happiness and being able to go take care of your family, engage in commerce, is fundamental to who we are as Americans, and I'd say in particular Texans. And so when I look at the woman who has the hair salon in Dallas right now, who's saying that she wants to keep her business open, and she's being told she can't, and then law enforcement's coming in and clamping down on her ability to do that, I've got reservations about that. And I've shared that concern with the governor's office. I called yesterday the head of the Texas licensing organization or agency, and we talked for a while, and I'm going to continue to share my belief that we need to reopen things and let the people decide. Let people vote with their feet. It's going to be hard enough for you all running businesses to get people to come in over fears without having the government telling you, well, 25%, 50%. I mean, now you're counting heads and you're going and looking at fire, marshal authorizations. And, I don't think that's the way we want to head. I think we want to head down the road of open it up, be cautious. You're self-interested and I'm self-interested in living. We've all faced tough things. I'm a cancer survivor, as you all know. I have no interest in myself or my family getting this virus. Neither do you. So when I'm in close quarters, will I want to use a mask or separate? Yeah. And I've seen that already. I've been out and about. I've been meeting with the sheriff's offices of every county, been going around and meeting with hospital administrators, going around 2 days ago, met with restaurateurs in Kerrville. And so I'm trying to engage with folks. And you know what? Everybody was being pretty rational. They weren't shaking hands. They were keeping 6-foot separations for the most part. And some people were wearing masks. Some people weren't, but they were doing it in a safe way. We're rational people, and we'll try to do that. I'll make one last point on that. Many of you may have seen the op-ed that I wrote in the Express News. It was about my father, who's a 77-year-old polio survivor. He lived through that pandemic of the 1940s and 50s, in which we had 300,000 of our children get inflicted by this terrible disease, and I think somewhere on the order of 30,000 who died. My dad was one of those who got the illness, got the disease, and he suffered the consequences his whole life. He has a tracheostomy. He has, he has difficulty climbing stairs, and he's fought through it. But he's been telling me and texting me and calling me, because I haven't seen him now for several months, talking about the pursuit of happiness and how he wants to see his his grandson play Little League and his granddaughter swim in a track meet. And he wants to come celebrate Easter with us and not, spend his time boxed away in a house, even though we obviously want to keep him safe. We're all rational. We'll all do the right thing, and we got to work forward to do that.
Very good. Thank you. That's an excellent answer. So a question. This is something this is one that I'm going to give you. I just learned about this yesterday. So, when we went through the BRAC process, of course, we had bases that were closed now, and they've turned into redevelopment authorities. One of them is called Brooks, and one of them is called Port San Antonio. Given they have such a unique nature of how they are, so they're not a local government, they're not a state agency necessarily, they're not a small business, they don't qualify for PPP. And so is there a way to be able to help them, because they have, many employees, they've got, a lot of things that they're doing. Is there an opportunity to give them some assistance?
Well, this is an issue that has been raised to me both for them as well as some of the, C6 organizations, other entities that, and you all, right, frankly, by the way.
We're one of them, that's right.
Right. And so, the chambers, some of the private clubs, right, which, by the way, a country club doesn't exactly, create sympathy among people, but there's hundreds of people and employees tied to clubs. So you've got these different entities, like chambers of commerce, and then now you're describing those guys. We need to make sure we're treating all employers and all entities alike at a minimum, in my view. It shouldn't matter whether you're a for-profit entity or the nature of your business, or whether, obviously nonprofits were included, but these other entities that are special purpose entities and clubs and like you said, like the chambers and organizations like that, we need to treat everybody the same in terms of how we handle their ability to maintain their employment levels. And obviously, to be I'll give a shout out to you, the Chamber of Commerce, right? You're an important advocate for all of the businesses who need help right now. And so, we need to make sure we're accounting for everybody in this deal. Again, to the point of the person who asked the question about the deficits, I'm not interested as fiscal conservative, and I'm assuming you all aren't either as businessmen and women, in just an open spigot from Washington and a sort of endless just continuing of funding, because frankly, it will undermine our free enterprise system. But there is a role here, the government, to bridge the gap, to deal with the fact that we've been clamping down on your ability to engage in commerce, and everybody ought to be treated the same and not pick winners and losers. It's one of my frustrations with the PPP's model. While there's some good parts to it, I don't like how much we've been picking winners and losers, and we can't do that. We've got to find a better model to be able to get through this, but most importantly, we got to restart and get going.
Excellent. All right, here's an interesting question. The city received $270 million from the federal government last week. While it does allow for paying for out-of-pocket expenses associated with COVID response, it does not let the city apply the funds to offset revenue losses. Would you be willing to ask for modifications to allow for cities and counties to use money to offset revenue losses, which currently cause city government to terminate tens of millions of dollars in investments in everything from workforce to economic development, etc.?
I need to go back and look at that and see exactly what the specifications were. I'll answer broadly, which is, number one, we passed $150 billion in the first bill, another $11 billion for testing in the last one, so $161 billion that has gone out to state and local governments. Now, what do I not know? I don't know how equitably that's been distributed. I don't know yet what streams have been attached, so now that's one that you're raising. So I need to go look at that, and I will. I certainly want to advocate on behalf of making sure that the cities that I'm representing and across the board in terms of their size are being equitably treated equitably. I will say this, though. I do think it's important that we have a strong message to state and local government that they need to get out of the way of free commerce, free enterprise, and individual Americans engaging in what they can do best to protect themselves and their families and engage in commerce before we open up any more spigots or subsidize state and local governments. We have a moral hazard problem. And I would say this, to the mayor or anybody listening, and happy to have this conversation openly and debate it out and figure out what's in the best interest of our communities. But I don't want to have the moral hazard of encouraging a continuation of state and local governments clamping down on the ability of a barber or a restaurant or anybody else to open up and figure out how to take care of themselves, their families, and employ people, and then expect Washington to be the one on the back end that's backfilling the economic loss and the harm created, both to private sector and, by the way, to then the diminished sales tax revenue, hotel revenue, et cetera, that we obviously see as a result of it. We're all in this together, and we need to work together to do it by all accounts. But I want to make sure we're being careful as to not sort of incentivize the continued clampdown of our ability to reengage.
Excellent. All right. So here's an interesting question. When do you feel is the safest time for K through 12 students to return to the classroom?
That's a great question, right? I mean, all of us are dealing with that. I have a 10-year-old and a 9-year-old. They just finished their studies and just bolted out the door with their dog. So I'm expecting her to start barking any minute. But, I've had an interesting report, or I guess plan would be the way to put it, by my friend Ovic Roy, who runs FreeOp, an entity based here in Austin, Texas. He and I have worked together. No relation, by the way. But Ovic's a good friend, and they laid out a plan. And he's an advocate for getting back, K through 12 as soon as humanly possible for two reasons. One, clearly the data is indicating very little impact of spreading the virus and the illness among those that are young, that are 18 and under. I mean, frankly, sort of 55, 60 and under. The risk is, relatively speaking, statistically speaking, low. That being said, obviously schools are a place where viruses are spread and shared, and everybody comes together and then they send it back home. So you got to account for the fact that grandparents live with with the younger folks, and if they go out and they get exposed. And there's all of those considerations, which I think are very real, and I certainly think are a reasonable debate for the governor, for the state and local officials doing that. Were I, deciding, I would probably be leaning more into reopen, because the single moms or frankly the double working families, or even a one working parent household, dealing with the impacts of having children at home is having then the secondary and tertiary economic implications and impact, and being able to get other things up and running and being able to handle that. We're demanding of our HEB employees, of our truckers, of our first responders, of our nurses, of our doctors, of our state employees and cops and everybody else. We're demanding that they continue to do the things that now allow us to engage in our lives because they're essential. Okay, well, I mean, every business is essential to the owner and the people who work for it. And by the way, all of these people we're asking to do these things and sacrifice for us. It's nice that we send them a note of thanks, but they're doing it every day. And so I think we all need to work together to try to figure out how to engage to get open as soon as possible. I would lean into it. Obviously, as time ticks, we're kind of nearing the end of this school year, but I think under no circumstances should we not be prepared to open our schools in August and frankly, really be on offense to engage to make sure that we're opening as soon as possible.
Excellent. Very good. Here's an interesting question. Moving forward, how can we continue to enhance protections for our most vulnerable populations, especially for those living in long-term care facilities where there is a shortage of staff and resources?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, nationwide, we've seen more in other places in the nation than in Texas, but that is a fantastic question, because the impact on our nursing homes and places that where we've seen the spread of the virus, and obviously the state of Washington dealt with that early. We've seen it unfortunately unfold in New York in those ways as well, and we've seen a couple of spots here in Texas that we need to pay attention to as well. And look, I think we need to continue to work on ways where we can ensure the safety and well-being of those our elderly that are in homes, especially with something like a virus like this. I also hope that we've got some, rethinking about a lot of what we do as families, about how we make sure we're individually, looking out for our parents and loved ones and figuring out how to, I'm running through this now. As I said, my dad's 77, he has tracheostomy, he's not that mobile. We're trying to figure out what we do. And, our hope is that we can, figure out how to, have him and my mom, be with us and just figure out the space. We don't have a bedroom right now, but we can figure it out. And so those are the kinds of things I hope we do. You ask a broader question, though, about what we can do for the most vulnerable. And for me, I believe that civil society and community is where you do that best. We see that every day with the food bank, right? We see that every day in state and local, not just authorities and governments, but in particular charities and our churches and our synagogues and our communities, where we come together to help those in need, right? We too often believe, for example, take the VA. We've got great VA. We're blessed to have in San Antonio, Kerrville, and that's awesome. But we shouldn't assume that because there's a federal program that the veteran down the street in your block or the veteran in your community is doing fine. We should be engaged to make sure the veteran down the street personally is fine, and do that through our nonprofit endeavors, or just frankly being a human. I'm hopeful that one of the things of us being kind of stuck at home and now people walking around communities and walking around blocks is they're remembering what community is. Look, we solve problems as Americans through community. It is part of our great history. So I think we need more of that. Look, I'm a believer, and I've been publicly outspoken, that I want to encourage federal policies that encourage community action and encourage, for example, health savings accounts and restructuring our healthcare system so that you have the ability to take care of yourself and your loved ones through tax advantage dollars, rather than hoping and relying on some insurance bureaucrat or government bureaucrat to tell you what your health care is going to be. We need to do more of those kinds of things, in my opinion, and I'm happy to talk to anyone in that specific question, or any of you that have ideas or thoughts on those issues. I'm happy to work with y'all on it.
Excellent. Thank you. So we're getting close to our time. Got a couple of two more quick questions. Will you see hazard pay? I know you touched upon this a little bit with essential workers. Do you see hazard pay for frontline workers in the next stimulus package, and how will that be done, since healthcare providers are working in higher risk conditions than grocery store workers? Interesting.
Well, I don't know the answer. I have not yet seen the specific proposals. I know that there's some floating around. I know I've been trying to get a bead on what the actual, problem is or isn't. Talking to healthcare providers, hospitals. I was meeting with a head that, of a regional hospital just 2 days ago, and working through the negative impact on hospital budgets and healthcare provider budgets by virtue of the mandate that we only serve, essential functions and not allow for elective surgeries and so forth, which, by the way, side note, and I'll come back to the question, the second order impacts of what we've been doing on healthcare is really concerning to me, right? If you're, a woman or, a man, right, if you're, not getting your mammogram or getting a, prostate screening or whatever right now, and then 2 weeks from now or a month or 2 months from now, you find out you've got stage 4 cancer that you might have known 2 months ago was stage 1, that's a problem. And I can give you 1,000 other examples, but I want our doctors to be able to go out and do preventative work right now because, every life that we're trying to save on the virus, understandably, what are we doing with respect to all of the impacts in terms of heart disease, in terms of mental health issues, in terms of opioid addiction, in terms of cancer? So I want to make sure we're out in front on those issues as well. Back to your question, not trying to bounce around too much. We need to take a look at that. I obviously want to make sure that we get back to normal as soon as possible and then figure out where did the PPP and or the other funding mechanisms already allocated fall short, right? Because, again, we've already spent $2.7 trillion. So I'm asking my team, and I'm working with others to do audits to figure out what we've spent, how it's been spent, has it been spent well, and who's been left out. I don't want, again, I'm a big believer in government doing its basic duty, and then whatever it does, it needs to be treating people equally and fairly and not picking winners and losers. That's the worst thing we can do. So we need to figure out how to make sure those that are out there on the front lines are certainly, not taking it on the chin. But of course, everybody right now, we're all going through this. We've got to figure out how to, get through it all together. So.
Very good. Thank you. So let's close on this one. So can you share with us the confidence level you have in our city, our state, and our nation as we move forward through this difficult time? Economics, attitude, pride, etc. What do you think?
I am eternally optimistic that we as Texans in particular, because it's who we are, but as Americans, who I think is who we are as well, I am eternally optimistic that we will kind of come through this with the ability to bounce and be ever stronger. Let's rewind to February. In order to get out of the economic crunch of the burgeoning social welfare state and the expense of Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid as a percentage of our overall budget, which was growing massively, we needed more economic growth than we had in February and March, right? We were getting happy about these sort of mid-2 kind of economic growth. We need 3.5%, 4% economic growth, right? We need serious economic growth to grow ourselves out of the amount of debt that we've been accumulating. We also need to have a rational approach to these problems that we've been dealing with that have been tucked away in political partisan corners for too long, where Republicans get in their corner and say, well, I'll cut a deal to, mortgage our children's future in order to get more defense spending. And my Democrat colleagues will do the same for non-defense discretionary spending. And the result is they both just shrug their shoulders and we get $1 trillion deficit. We can't do that anymore. We need to have the resources to deal with rainy days like we're dealing with right now. Will we get through this? Yes. World War II, we had as much debt as we have right now, roughly, as a percentage of our GDP. So there is a path forward. But that path forward requires us to work together, solve the problem, have a rational response to the problem. And here's the biggest part. You all are leaders. I've been giving the same speech to the sheriff's offices, to the hospitals, first responders, everybody I talk to. We have an obligation to instill confidence in the people, that we are building an environment and a set of protocols that will enable us to reengage, and that we need people to be smart. We need people to be, compassionate, but smart, engaged, and get people out working. We've been having so much conversation in the 24/7 media and social media that it just browbeat into people a fear of the virus, rather than a rational understanding that if you exclude 65 and older, and particularly if you exclude regional issues, that the virus is very manageable. In other words, if you take out New York, New Jersey, and you focus on 0 to 65-year-olds, it's relatively negligible. right? Now, I don't mean that negligible in terms of the impact on any one individual who gets the virus. I just mean statistically. So we need to figure out how to protect the vulnerable, protect the elderly, work on it in a way that we can reopen. Know that Kerr County had 5 cases out of 50,000 population. So Kerr might have slightly different protocols than San Antonio, which has very different protocols than New York City. So we can do this. Look, Governor Abbott is leaning into this to try to get us reopened. If you're a leader in your community, as you are, speak up. Go to your church. We can open our churches. We can open our synagogues. We can re-engage society. We need it. We're people that like to interact with each other, and we should and we need to. And for our mental health and the well-being of our kids and our grandkids, we've got to get our economy back. We can't let that freight train come to a screeching halt. So that's my perspective on it.
All right. Well, very well said. And so that will be my last question for you. I just want to say thank you, Congressman Roy. As always, you speak with a very clear mind, very direct. And I want to also thank you for taking these different variety of questions. I mean, we went all over the map, and so you've been very gracious and very straightforward. So thank you for that.
Well, let me just say I'm happy to do it any time. And if any of you have any questions about your businesses or the PPP or loans or anything, please reach out to my office. We're trying to respond to everybody within 24 hours, and we're here for you. And I'm here to answer questions anytime. Reach out, call my office. I'm happy to come meet, and I want to come meet in person. And I'm going to be going to restaurants as much as I can now that they're opening up, and happy to sit down with folks anywhere and have discussions about what to do.
Excellent. Well, there were several questions that we didn't get to just because we ran out of time. So we'll send those to your team. And then when you answer them, we'll put them on our website so that everybody can know what's going on. And of course, as we said at the beginning, this has been recorded so people can go back and watch this at a future time. But thanks again. And I'd also like to thank, yes, sir. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say thank you. God bless you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd also like to thank everyone who's joined us today. Thank you for submitting questions. Thank you for your patience in this new medium. I do think it's a great way to be able to hear directly and clearly, as you've just seen from Congressman Roy. I also want to do a very special thank you again to our sponsors, Southwest Airlines, Walmart, Lockheed Martin, Port San Antonio, Vulcan Materials Company, and the San Antonio River Authority. Again, we'll have all this, the recording, it usually takes about 24 hours for the recording to be ready. We'll post it to our our San Antonio Chamber Rapid Response.org website. And let me just close by thanking you all. The chamber, your chamber, has been busy working on your behalf. We've doubled down on our efforts in this very difficult time. Again, please visit our website. Call us. We're here to work for you. We work for you. And with that, I'll close by saying thank you. Be safe, be kind, and be healthy. Take care.